Imagine being locked away, strapped to a bed, forgotten by society, while your screams echo through stone halls no one cares to enter. The cold air clings to your skin, the smell of urine and bleach soaked into the stone, and your name slowly fades until you are nothing more than a patient number scribbled in a ledger. They called it treatment. They called it care. But behind the locked iron gates of Victorian asylums, what happened was something else entirely. Restraint chairs that left bruises on your wrists, ice baths that stole your breath, forced labor in filthy linen rooms, breaking your spirit day by day. And outside those thick walls, society was content to look away, pretending the screams weren't real. This was not the past of a faraway, brutal empire. This was Victorian England, where the unwanted were hidden under the polite lie of care, and where madness was not something to treat, but something to punish and control. This is not a ghost story, though the ghosts remain in every abandoned asylum's rotting hallway. This is the real, raw horror of Victorian mental health care, and tonight we will step inside, because history is dark and we must remember it. In Victorian England, madness was a shadow that terrified society. Cities were swelling with people, factories belched smoke into the skies, and narrow streets filled with the noise of industry and poverty. Among that crowding and chaos, those who talked to themselves, who screamed in alleyways, or who wandered confused became reminders of a fragility the Victorians desperately wanted to ignore. So they built asylums. Massive, fortress-like buildings rose on the edges of towns and in the countryside, promising families a place to hide away those who did not fit the rigid expectations of sanity and productivity. There was optimism at first, speeches in Parliament about moral treatment, fresh air, and gentle care. Families who could afford it believed these places would help their loved ones. But optimism rotted quickly. The asylums filled beyond capacity, with men, women, and even children packed into wards that stank of sweat and despair. Funding was never enough, food was meager, and staff were overworked or cruel, sometimes both. What had been a promise of treatment became a convenient dumping ground, a place to lock away the inconvenient, the embarrassing, the poor, the traumatized, and those whose minds broke under the harshness of Victorian life. Respectable families signed the papers and turned their backs, reputations protected as their relatives vanished behind iron gates. The asylums became cities within cities, ruled by doctors and attendants who decided who was mad, who was cured, and who would never leave. It was never about treatment. It was about hiding away what society did not want to see. Who ended up in these looming Victorian asylums? Almost anyone, for almost any reason. Women were among the most frequent prisoners of these institutions. A wife who talked back, a daughter who refused marriage, a mother who fell into despair after childbirth. All could be labeled hysterical. Doctors with confident mustaches wrote female hysteria on forms, and iron gates slammed shut behind women who simply did not conform to what husbands or fathers expected. A woman's tears, her exhaustion, her rage at a life of confinement could be enough to send her into a different prison, one with locked doors and barred windows. Men, too, found themselves dragged into asylums, often for alcoholism, or for minds fractured by the relentless grind of Victorian labor. The man who collapsed into nightmares after losing a limb in a factory accident, who woke screaming from the memory of machinery tearing flesh, might be deemed insane and locked away. Poverty itself could become a diagnosis. If a man wandered too long on the streets, talking to himself or begging, the asylum was seen as the solution. And there were children with epilepsy, children born with disabilities, or those who simply acted wrong, in classrooms or homes found themselves inside asylum walls. Some were locked up for their own protection. Others were left there simply because parents could not, or would not, care for them. They were often placed in adult wards, among the screams of the tormented, subjected to the same treatments, the same restraints, and the same cold indifference. The most chilling part was how easy it was to commit someone. A father's signature, a husband's word, a doctor's quick judgment could erase a person's freedom. There were no real appeals, no second opinions for the poor or for inconvenient women and children. Once you were inside, the outside world forgot you. Your name slowly fading from family conversations as the iron doors closed and the world moved on without you. The Victorian Asylum was not a place of healing. It was a place to make people disappear. Inside the asylum, each day was a slow, grinding erosion of hope. Bleak, grey, walled rooms held row after row of iron. Framed beds, too close for comfort, each mattress thin and sour-smelling. Soaked over the years by sweat, fear, and sometimes worse. The wards were overcrowded, bodies packed together like crates in a warehouse. Patients coughing, weeping, or sitting in vacant silence, rocking back and forth, because there was nothing else to do. Meals were bowls of thin gruel or stale bread, often cold, served without kindness. You ate quickly, if you could eat at all, surrounded by the constant sounds of groans, muttering, and the clatter of tin cups on tables. The air was damp, filled with the chill of unheated stone corridors, and the heavy scent of unwashed bodies, and the disinfectants the staff sometimes splashed around to cover the stink. Silence was the law inside these walls. Talking out of turn, shouting, even crying too loudly could lead to punishment, restraint, isolation, or being strapped down until you calmed. Staff moved through the halls with keys jangling, faces hard, and eyes already looking past you. They enforced strict routines: wake, eat, sit, work, sleep, again and again, until the days blurred into a grey smear of time. There was no therapy, not really. There was labor. Patients scrubbed floors, washed endless piles of laundry, cleaned latrines, or worked on asylum farms. The vegetables they grew sold to fund the very institution that kept them locked away. It was a system that made profit from the unpaid toil of those deemed too mad to live outside, yet well enough to break their backs in labor until their minds broke too. It didn't matter if you were sick, exhausted, or terrified. Refusing to work could mean punishment, tied to a restraint chair, confined to a dark cell, or forced into cold baths until your will bent under the weight of freezing water and fear. They called it moral therapy. You might call it slavery under another name. Victorian therapy: scrub floors until you forget you're human. In the end, it was a place where you learned quickly that the outside world had abandoned you, and that inside these walls, your only purpose was to be silent, to labor, and to wait, day after day, for the world to forget you existed. They called them treatments. In reality, they were slow, systematic tortures dressed in the language of care. Restraint chairs, heavy wooden chairs with straps for arms, legs, chest, and sometimes even the head, were used to bind patients for hours, days, even weeks, under the justification that it would calm their minds. You could be tied down so tightly that your skin would blister beneath the leather straps, your limbs would swell and go numb, and your own screams would echo back at you in the cold, hollow room while you waited, trapped, to be deemed quiet enough to be freed. Straitjackets became uniforms for many, forcing arms across the chest, cutting off circulation, leaving bruises and abrasions under the cloth. It didn't matter if you needed help. If you resisted, you were strapped in and left in corners, rocking and weeping until exhaustion replaced your fear. Then there were ice baths, a favorite method to shock patients into calm. Staff would plunge struggling bodies into freezing water, holding them under until they stopped thrashing, the icy bite sinking into their bones, stripping away breath and warmth, leaving them shivering, teeth chattering violently, lips turning blue, gasping for air as they were pulled out only to be forced back under again. It was called therapy. It felt like drowning. Rotational therapy was equally horrific. Patients were strapped into chairs or swings and spun rapidly until they vomited, their eyes rolling back, consciousness slipping in and out as the world became a nauseating blur. Doctors believed this would reset the mind, forcing calm through physical collapse. Bleeding and purging were another standard. Leeches applied to draw out the bad humors, or veins cut open while you were held down, watching your own blood spill into bowls. If you resisted, it only proved your madness and the necessity of more treatment. Purgatives and emetics forced you to vomit or defecate repeatedly, leaving you weak, dehydrated, and humiliated on the cold stone floors. Early electric shocks were administered without understanding. Primitive batteries applied to the temples or spine, sending jolts through your body that snapped your muscles tight, made your eyes bulge, and left you trembling violently while your heart raced in terror. They claimed it would reset the brain, but it only left burns, pain, and confusion. Blistering therapy involved applying hot irons or caustic substances to the skin to raise blisters, under the belief that draining them would draw out madness. The smell of burned flesh, the searing agony, the festering wounds. It was all part of the cure. Every one of these treatments was done under the banner of medicine, but inside those walls, it was simply pain disguised as care. You were forced to comply, to break, to submit, until the fear of the treatment was worse than any madness you carried inside you. It wasn't healing. It was control. It was punishment for being unwell. A system designed to silence the suffering under the guise of salvation. And the screams that filled the asylum halls were proof that these therapies didn't cure madness. They only created a new kind of torment, one that could haunt you long after your body was finally freed. If you dig through the yellowing records of Victorian asylums, the official reports and hidden testimonies, you find stories that make your stomach tighten. You find a patient's note, scribbled in trembling handwriting. "Please, untee me. My arms burn. I will be calm. Please. I am thirsty." It was found years later in the seams of a mattress, the patient long dead, their name reduced to a case number. Records from Bethlehem, Bedlam, Broadmoor, and smaller provincial asylums note patients tied in restraint chairs for days, their skin rotting beneath straps, developing sores that oozed, attracting flies as they begged for water in the heat of summer or shivered in winter drafts. A woman, committed for hysteria after childbirth, was documented pleading each day to see her child, her requests ignored as part of her treatment plan. One man was admitted for alcoholism and depression after losing his job, forcibly restrained when he shouted at the walls in desperation. He spent weeks in a straitjacket, given only minimal food, with nurses noting he was restless and non-compliant. The truth, he was begging to be allowed outside to see the sky. Wrongful commitments were common. A husband could have his wife committed for disobedience. An inheritance could be secured by declaring a relative mad. Once inside, the patient's protests became evidence of insanity, each cry a further justification for restraint and isolation. A wealthy uncle who refused to sign over land suddenly found himself in a padded cell, diagnosed with mania. The family quietly taking control of his property while he rotted behind locked doors. Nurses and attendants sometimes left confessions in letters, terrified to sign their names. One wrote, The screams haunt me. We are told it is treatment, but I see patients who come in quiet, and after the ice baths and the spinning, they never speak again." Another described the horror of the restraint rooms, where patients lay strapped to beds, soiled, pleading for the straps to be loosened as their arms turned purple. She wrote about the smell, the mix of urine, sweat, and disinfectant that clung to the walls, and how the moans in the night made her dread her rounds. Patient records tell of being force-fed, of teeth broken by gags, of emetics forced down throats while attendants held them down, vomit pooling on the floor. One young girl, committed for feeble-mindedness, was listed as calm after treatment, which meant she was so weakened by purging and bleeding that she could barely lift her head. Even official reports from Victorian inspectors occasionally noted concerns. The conditions in the lower wards are unfit for human beings. The air stale, the patients left in rags, some in states of filth. But the machine of the asylum continued, justified by the fear of madness and the promise of social order. Behind the stone walls and iron gates, the stories were the same forgotten souls, begging to be seen, touched, or freed. Restraint used not as treatment, but as punishment for being ill, different, or simply inconvenient. And the records remain cold, clinical handwriting that fails to capture the screams, the scratching of nails on doors, or the soft weeping of those who realized they would never leave. Victorian asylums stood tall in towns and cities, their brick facades and iron gates presented as monuments to progress and charity. The public was told they were places of healing, where the mad were cared for, treated with compassion, and safely removed from society for everyone's protection. Wealthy donors would tour the halls, guided past clean wards with calm patience. They saw tidy beds, patients knitting quietly, nurses standing watch. They dropped donations into the collection boxes, praised the asylum directors in speeches, and left satisfied that they had done their Christian duty. But that was the front stage. Behind the walls, the reality was screams echoing through stone corridors at night. Patients wept and begged behind locked doors, pleading for their families, for water, for the straps to be loosened. The stink of urine and sweat filled the air, where ventilation was poor and windows were nailed shut against escape, rather than opened for fresh air. The stigma of madness was society's blindfold. Families whispered of nervous troubles or hysteria, but never visited, preferring to forget the relative hidden away in the asylum's cold embrace. Once labeled mad, a person's protests became proof of insanity, their tears seen as symptoms, their resistance as aggression. Society didn't want to look too closely. The idea of madness was terrifying enough that people accepted the need for restraint and silence. The public convinced themselves it was better this way, that the mad were better off behind walls, out of sight. Sometimes cracks appeared. Newspapers occasionally ran stories when a death was too suspicious to hide. A journalist might report a patient who died strapped in a restraint chair, or a young woman who was dragged, screaming, to an ice bath, only to be found lifeless later. They wrote of overcrowding, the filth, the weeping patients lying in rags on cold floors. But these stories often faded from the headlines within days, replaced by society news and political scandals. Nothing changed. Directors defended the need for harsh treatments. Doctors claimed it was necessary for patient safety. Families turned away, telling themselves it was for the best. And so the reality remained hidden behind those imposing walls, a world of locked doors, leather straps, cold baths, screams in the dark, and the quiet weeping of those who realized they had been abandoned. The asylums were not places of healing. They were warehouses of forgotten souls, smoothed over by polite lies and the public's fear of seeing what truly happened to the unwanted in a society desperate to appear civilized. As the 19th century neared its end, cracks in the asylum walls began to widen. Whispers of overcrowding, starvation, and brutality could no longer be ignored, forcing society to look directly at what it had hidden away. Investigations and reports began surfacing, often driven by reformers willing to step into these cold, echoing halls. In Britain, visitors and early journalists described wards so packed that patients slept on straw, covered floors, chained to walls, or forced to huddle in corners, filth accumulating around them. The stench, they reported, was enough to make visitors gag. In the United States, Dorothea Dix emerged as a relentless voice for the forgotten, visiting jails and asylums and documenting the horrors. She found the naked, the beaten, the neglected, men and women chained for years without hope of release. Her reports shocked legislatures, though the response was often slow. Across Britain and parts of Europe, similar voices began to echo. Inspectors uncovered rotting food, forced labor without pay, and treatments that were simply torture repackaged as care. The truth was impossible to ignore when patients were found strapped down, covered in sores, or rocking endlessly in corners after years of isolation. A philosophy of moral treatment slowly took root. This new approach claimed that patients needed fresh air, work with dignity, and humane treatment to recover. Gardens were added to some asylums, harsh restraints reduced in places, and staff were urged to treat patients with kindness. But reality often fell far short of ideals. Funding was scarce, overcrowding continued, and many asylum directors resisted change, seeing restraints and forced silence as necessary for order. For every facility that removed chains, many more continued to use them. Hidden behind the heavy doors society refused to open. Change was slow, uneven, and deeply flawed, but it began. The world was starting, piece by piece, to confront the darkness it had allowed to thrive in the name of medical care, law, and social order. And the patients, many long forgotten and broken, became the tragic proof of what happens when fear, ignorance, and cruelty hide behind brick walls and locked iron doors. Today, many Victorian asylums still stand, their brick walls cracked, windows shattered, ivy crawling across the stones like the fingers of the dead. Some have been turned into apartments or offices, but others remain abandoned, silent witnesses to the screams that once echoed through their halls. Locals whisper that these buildings are haunted, that if you walk the overgrown grounds at dusk, you can hear faint cries, the rattle of chains, the slow scrape of straitjackets against stone. Whether ghost stories or echoes of trauma, these remnants are reminders of a time when fear was hidden behind locked doors and high walls. The evolution toward modern mental health care has moved far from cold stone wards and restraint chairs, yet the shadows remain. Stigma still clings to mental illness, and underfunded systems continue to fail many who need care. Even if the methods of cruelty have changed, society has always had a tendency to hide what it fears, labeling it madness, locking it away rather than facing it. Those who did not conform to Victorian norms, women who resisted control, men broken by war or poverty, children who struggled to fit in, were swept into asylums to protect the image of respectable society. Even now, the legacy of the Victorian asylum reminds us of the dangers of unchecked power, of what happens when society prioritizes order over compassion, control over care. What remains are lessons soaked in the cold silence of abandoned wards, urging us to remember the countless souls who suffered in the name of treatment, their pain hidden so others could forget the uncomfortable truths about themselves and the society they built. Fear, ignorance, and power. When these forces intersect, they leave scars on history deeper than any wound. Victorian asylums were built with promises of healing, yet they became houses of horror, where suffering was hidden under the guise of treatment, and the unwanted were silenced behind cold walls. These places remind us how easily society can choose cruelty over care, how fear can justify inhumanity, and how ignorance can blind generations to the pain of others. History is dark, and we must remember it.